From the time I was just a kid, my life has been one adrenaline-fueled adventure after another. Be it mountain climbing in the Rockies, parasailing over the coast of California, or scuba diving in the depths of the Florida Keys, I've always had an insatiable thirst for pushing boundaries. But if there's one sport that holds a special place in my heart, it's skiing. Growing up, my winters were defined by numerous trips to the snowy uplands of Vermont, where the crisp mountain air and the pristine white slopes became my winter sanctuary. This particular adventure began on a frosty morning in late February, with the promise of fresh powder and clear skies. My buddy, whom I'll call Jake, and I had been planning this trip for months. The idea was to venture out for some backcountry skiing, away from the manicured trails of commercial resorts, into the untamed wilderness where the snow lay untouched and where true adventure awaited. Jake and I had known each other since college, a bond forged through shared dorms and even more shared interests in extreme sports. So, when I suggested we take this trip, his immediate response was a resounding yes. The journey to our destination was a 3-hour drive north, followed by an hour of off-roading through dense forests that seemed to swallow the narrow dirt track we were on. Our destination was a secluded spot known only to a few avid skiers and local legends. We finally parked my old, battered truck at the edge of a clearing, where the forest opened up to reveal rolling hills that looked like waves frozen in time, blanketed by a thick layer of snow. It was perfect. The tranquility of the place was palpable, broken only by the crunch of snow under our boots as we unloaded our gear. Skis, poles, and backpacks filled with camping essentials. With our equipment strapped to our backs, we trekked about a quarter-mile into the heart of the woods. The weight of the gear made each step laborious, but the anticipation of the descent made it worthwhile. We set up camp in a small clearing at the base of a particularly inviting slope. The routine was mechanical and practiced, setting up the tent, rolling out the sleeping bags, and preparing a small fire pit for the cold night ahead. Once our base was established, we wasted no time and began our ascent up the hill. The hike was tough, the steep incline challenging our fitness, but the promise of an exhilarating ski down kept our spirits high. We reached the summit just as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a perfect backdrop to our adventure. As we prepared to make our first descent, the thrill was palpable. We pushed off with a shout, the world blurring into streaks of white and blue as we carved through the snow. The freedom was exhilarating. This was what we lived for. Halfway down, Jake and I took different paths, weaving through trees and over small jumps. In the thrill of the moment, we lost sight of each other. I wasn't worried. This was typical for us. I reached the bottom, expecting Jake to appear any minute, laughing about who took the better line. I waited, catching my breath and relishing the silence of the wilderness. After a few minutes, there was still no sign of him. I pulled out my walkie-talkie and tried to contact him, but all I got was static. Deciding he was probably just taking his time or enjoying another run, I decided to scout around. That's when I met the stranger. Emerging from the tree line, skis in tow, he approached me. Beneath his ski mask, his voice was friendly, inquiring about the slopes and whether we were camping nearby. He explained that he and his wife were looking for a spot to set up for the night. Despite my initial hesitation, something about his friendly demeanor made me decide to help him out. I agreed to lead him back to our campsite, signaling Jake over the walkie-talkie that I'd return shortly. As we walked back, the stranger behind me, small talk filled the air. Yet, a sense of unease began to grow within me, something about the situation not sitting right. When we reached the campsite, the first thing he asked, with a sudden change in tone, was where his wife was. I turned to answer, only to find him advancing toward me with a startling intensity. It was then that I noticed the details that I had missed before. The skis, the backpack, they were Jake's. My heart raced as the realization dawned on me. This wasn't a friendly skier lost in the woods. This was someone dangerous. As he drew closer, instinct took over. I dove for the tent, my hands scrambling for the flare gun in my backpack. The sharp pain of a knife plunged into my leg halted my search. I screamed, not just in pain but in terror, as the stranger advanced. In a surge of adrenaline, I managed to grab the flare gun, aiming it shakily at him. He halted, hands raised, eyes wide in fear. Using the moment to my advantage, I demanded to know where Jake was. His answer was rushed, almost frantic, pointing back to the hill where I had last seen my friend. As I dialed 911 with trembling fingers, the stranger took his chance to flee. Left alone, bleeding and shaken, I awaited rescue. The sound of the approaching helicopter the most comforting noise I'd ever heard. Stay tuned for part 2, where the story continues with the search for Jake and the aftermath of our harrowing adventure. The whirl of the helicopter blades was like a symphony to my ears as I lay in the snow, clutching my injured leg. The cold was biting, seeping through my layers, but the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept the worst of the shivers at bay. I fired the flare gun into the darkening sky, its bright red arc a beacon of hope. Within minutes, the rescue team was on the ground, their professional calm a stark contrast to the chaos of the past hour. They quickly administered first aid, staunching the bleeding with expert precision before loading me onto the stretcher. The pain was sharp, a constant reminder of the encounter, but my thoughts were elsewhere, on Jake. I relayed his last known location to the rescuers, my voice urgent, the fear for my friend overshadowing my own pain. The helicopter lifted off with a gust of wind, the ground crew shining their powerful lights down the slope as we hovered over the area where I last saw Jake. It didn't take long to find him, his bright yellow jacket a stark against the white snow, even in the dim light. He was lying still, a distressing sight that had my heart in my throat. We landed nearby, and the medics rushed to his side. I watched, helpless, as they checked his vitals and treated his injuries. He was unconscious, his face pale against the stark red of his blood-stained snow. The medic turned to me, nodding reassuringly. "He's alive," he said, the words lifting a weight off my chest. Jake had been stabbed twice in the leg, the same as me. It was clear we had been targeted, but by whom and why remained a mystery. The authorities arrived soon after, their questions sharp and probing. I recounted the events, describing the stranger and the terror he'd instilled. They listened intently, taking notes and promising a thorough investigation. The hospital was a blur of white walls and antiseptic smells. Jake and I were placed in adjacent rooms, a small comfort as I waited for news on his condition. It was hours before I got the chance to see him, his face lined with pain but alive, a sight for sore eyes. "Hey!" Jake's voice was weak but carried a warmth that filled the small room. "Hey yourself," I replied, managing a small smile despite the ache in my heart. "You had me worried there." He chuckled, the sound rough around the edges. "Likewise. Did they catch him?" I shook my head, the uncertainty a heavy shadow in the room. "No, but they're on it. We'll get some answers soon." Jake nodded, his gaze drifting to the window. We were silent for a moment, each lost in our thoughts about the ordeal and its unexpected brutality. The following days were a mix of pain management and police interviews. The authorities worked with the descriptions and evidence we provided. but the man seemed to have vanished into thin air. It was frustrating, the lack of closure like an open wound. As we recovered, Jake and I had time to reflect on the incident. "You think it was just random?" he asked one afternoon, his brow furrowed in thought. I considered it, the randomness of the attack, unsettling. "I don't know, man. It felt personal, like he knew what he was doing, knew where to find us." "Yeah," Jake agreed, his tone somber. "We need to be more careful, pick our spots better." The incident changed us, made us more cautious. The thrill of adventure still called to us, but now there was a shadow, a reminder of the risks that went beyond mere physical challenges. Several weeks later, we were back home, our wounds mostly healed, though the scars remained, both physical and emotional. The police had no leads, the case growing cold as the snow in which it had occurred. But our resolve had only strengthened. We were survivors, bound by an experience that few could understand. In the aftermath, our love for the wild, for the untouched corners of the world, didn't diminish. If anything, it grew, tempered by a newfound respect for the dangers that lay in wait. We planned our next trip, our spirits undeterred, our friendship deeper for having shared not just the joys of adventure, but its darkest moments as well. As we looked ahead, the mountains still called to us, their snow-capped peaks a challenge and a promise. We would return, not just to conquer the slopes, but to reclaim the freedom that had always driven us. The wild had tested us, but we had endured, our passion for adventure burning all the brighter against the cold shadows of our past. Christmas in the suburbs has always had a certain charm for me. Picture it. Streets lined with homes decked out in festive lights, frost on the windows, the distant sound of holiday music wafting through the air. My wife and I were staying at her childhood home, where her mother now lived alone, aside from a couple of cats. It's a single-story house nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, complete with a neatly trimmed lawn and an American flag fluttering gently at the front. The house itself is nothing out of the ordinary for the area. An attached garage fronts the property, featuring 2 doors aside from the main, electrically operated one. One of these doors leads to the garden and backyard, equipped with an old doggy door, a relic from the days of their beloved dog, Max. They've since nailed a wooden board over it, a makeshift solution that's always struck me as a bit precarious. The other door opens into the kitchen, barely sturdy enough to stop a mouse, let alone an unwanted intruder. It was during this serene holiday setting that an incident occurred which shook us to our core, changing our perspective on home safety forever. We had settled in for the night in my wife's old bedroom at the front of the house. I remember falling into a deep sleep, the kind that's heavy and enveloping, when suddenly, a piercing scream tore through the silence of the house. It was 3 a.m. The scream wasn't just loud. It was primal, full of fear. My mother-in-law's voice echoed down the hallway. "What are you doing?" It hit my ears like a jet engine, jolting me awake. In those groggy, disoriented first moments, I could sense the urgency in her voice. This wasn't a startled yelp or a casual shout. There was real terror there. It's funny how the primitive parts of our brain kick in during these moments. Despite being half asleep, my instincts understood the severity of the situation. As someone who's watched more than their fair share of true crime documentaries, I was instantly filled with a dreadful realization that this could be a life or death scenario. The question of whether you're a fight or flight person always seems abstract until you're tested. That night, I discovered I'm a fighter, fueled by a mix of fear and adrenaline. I found myself growling, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from someone else, declaring, I'm going to kill you." As I leaped from the bed, I stormed out of the bedroom, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and sprinted down the hallway. At the end, I saw my mother-in-law, clad in her nightgown, a look of utter shock frozen on her face. Our eyes met for a split second as I raced past her toward the kitchen. What I saw next was a scene straight out of a burglary gone wrong. The door to the kitchen, which was nothing more than a hollow core, had been completely obliterated, its shards scattered across the floor. Through the broken doorway, I could see the electric garage door wide open. As I burst into the garage, the sounds of chaos met my ears, the distinctive noise of someone scrambling into a vehicle just out of sight. I made it to the driveway just in time to see a car peeling away from the curb. In a burst of foolhardy bravery, I ran barefoot after the car, but it was no use. The vehicle sped away into the night, leaving me panting and barefoot on the cold asphalt. The police arrived within minutes, a response time that was both impressive and reassuring. They took our statements in the living room, the blue lights of their cruisers casting eerie shadows through the windows. My mother-in-law explained she had been awoken by the sound of the door being forced open and had walked in on the intruder, a small framed woman apparently surprised in the act of burglary. The officers theorized that the woman was likely part of a larger team, her role being to slip through the doggy door, breach the interior, and open the garage for her accomplices. Luckily, the combination of my mother-in-law confronting her and my impromptu threat seemed to have scared her off. Reflecting on the event, I felt a mix of pride and relief. Pride that I had instinctively protected my family, and relief that no one was harmed. Needless to say, we replaced the flimsy kitchen door with the heaviest, most robust wooden door you could imagine. I joked with the installer that I'd like to see a mouse try to get through that, but my laughter masked a deeper sense of security that had been restored to our family home. This experience, harrowing as it was, reminded us of the importance of preparedness and the unpredictable nature of life, even in the safety of one's home during the peaceful Christmas season. The aftermath of that night lingered in our minds long after the broken door was replaced and the police had finished their investigation. Christmas, a time usually marked by joy and togetherness, had taken a stark turn towards vulnerability and fear. In the weeks that followed, my wife and I grappled with the shaken sense of security that one tends to take for granted in the familiarity of a childhood home. Our discussions often circled back to what-ifs. What if her mother hadn't woken up? What if I hadn't reacted as I did? What if the intruder had been armed? Our return to normalcy was gradual. My mother-in-law, who had always been an independent spirit, was understandably shaken. We encouraged her to stay with us for a while, offering comfort and company as she wrestled with her own nerves. Meanwhile, my wife and I undertook a thorough review of the home's security measures, determined to fortify it against any potential threats in the future. We installed a modern security system, complete with cameras and motion sensors. Each new addition to the home's defenses brought a small piece of peace back to us. As spring approached, the incident became a less frequent topic of conversation, but the lessons it imparted remained. I found myself more vigilant, more aware of my surroundings, and more appreciative of the calm moments. My wife and I often took evening walks, discussing plans for the future, reflecting on our growth through adversity, and contemplating how we might further enhance our preparedness. One particularly warm evening, as we walked through the neighborhood, my wife squeezed my hand and mentioned how proud she was of how we handled everything. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "sometimes it takes a shock to the system to appreciate what you've got and to take action to protect it." She was right. Our experience had spurred us into action, not just in terms of home security, but also in strengthening our familial bonds. We decided to turn our newfound vigilance into a community effort. With the support of neighbors, many of whom had been stirred by our ordeal, we established a neighborhood watch program. Meetings were held, roles were assigned, and everyone pitched in to keep an eye out for one another. It was empowering to see the community come together, driven by a collective desire to protect our neighborhood and support each other. As the year progressed, these efforts bore fruit. Incidents in the neighborhood decreased, and a new sense of camaraderie developed among the residents. People who had barely spoken to each other were now greeting each other warmly, sharing news, and watching out for each other's homes. Our little cul-de-sac had transformed from a quiet street of individuals into a close-knit community of active and engaged neighbors. The incident also deepened the bond between my wife, her mother, and me. We were more than just family. We were a team that had faced adversity and emerged stronger. Our weekly dinners, once simple affairs, became times of laughter, shared stories, and mutual support. My mother-in-law, once again living in her own home, took pride in the new security measures and often joked that she felt like she was living in Fort Knox. I remember working at the mall vividly. It was a kind of limbo between my youth and the adult world I was hesitantly stepping into. At 22, freshly graduated with little direction but a lot of ambition, I found myself slinging clothes at a popular retail outlet, hoping to scrape together enough to carve out my own space in this sprawling, hectic world. Those days often stretched long, especially during the holiday season when the mall became a bustling hub of activity. By the time I clocked out, the sun would have dipped below the horizon, casting the parking lot in shadows that seemed to stretch and yawn across the concrete. I'd hurry through the cool evening air, my footsteps echoing off the storefronts, toward the bus stop that sat on the edge of the lot. It wasn't the most welcoming of places after dark, frequented by a scattering of figures that most would cross the street to avoid, druggies, creeps, and the occasional lost soul looking for a bus that never seemed to come on time. On this particular night, the air was chillier than usual, and the bus stop was more desolate, save for the usual flickering street lamp that gave off a harsh, unreliable light. I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I made my way there, the echoes of the mall's closing announcements still ringing in my ears. As I neared the bus stop, I noticed a truck parked awkwardly to the side, its engine humming softly in the quiet night. Standing beside it was a man speaking to a young girl, who couldn't have been older than a teenager. She was dressed in the typical fast food uniform, a reminder of the legion of teens who manned the food courts, often working those thankless late shifts on weekends. Initially, I didn't think much of it. It was routine for parents to pick up their kids after their shifts, and at first glance, it seemed this was just another evening pickup. Maybe they'd had a disagreement, teen angst clashing with parental authority, a story as old as time. But as I got closer, a cold prickle of unease washed over me. The girl's eyes were wide, her posture tense, as if she was ready to bolt at any moment. The man noticed me approaching and his gaze snapped to mine, sharp and assessing. I nodded politely, the way you do when you catch a stranger's eye, and sat down on the cold metal bench of the bus stop. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see him leaning in closer to the girl, his voice low but urgent. "Come on, honey, let's get in the truck now. Mom's worried," he pressed. Her response was a slow, cautious step backward. That's when our eyes met properly. The fear in them was unmistakable, and it sent a shiver down my spine. He, meanwhile, reeked of liquor, not enough to stagger, but enough to make it clear he'd been drinking. With a sinking feeling, I realized the bus wouldn't be arriving for another 30 minutes. At 5 feet tall, I felt alarmingly inadequate in the face of whatever this situation might require of me. But something in me stiffened, a resolve I didn't know I had. The protective instinct, perhaps, or just basic human decency. "I haven't seen you in so long," I exclaimed with feigned brightness, stepping towards the girl. She glanced at me, confusion registering briefly before a flicker of understanding crossed her face. Gratefully, she moved to sit next to me at the bus stop, putting physical distance between her and the man. He scowled, clearly annoyed, and stomped back to his truck. I hoped he would leave, but no such luck. After a moment, he was back, phone pressed to his ear, a harsh tone to his voice as he growled, "Okay, dumb kid, get in the truck. Your mom's pissed. And lady," his eyes swiveled to me, "mind your business. This is a parent and child issue." Calm as I could, I met his gaze. "She clearly doesn't know you. It's best you leave before this gets worse for you. There are cameras all around, you know?" He hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Perhaps he hadn't considered the surveillance. He made a move as if to grab the girl, his intentions clear, but I stood up quickly, positioning myself between them. The standoff was interrupted by the sight of a security guard in the mall's entrance, his expression concerned as he caught my eye. I shook my head slightly, and he was quick to act, unlocking the door and reaching for his phone. The man, realizing his situation was deteriorating rapidly, finally gave up. He spat a curse, climbed into his truck, and sped off, leaving a cloud of exhaust and a heavy silence behind. The girl beside me trembled, tears streaming down her face as the reality of what had nearly happened began to sink in. I put an arm around her, whispering reassurances until her real parents arrived. Not long after, thanks to a frantic phone call from their daughter. As I recounted the event to the police, giving them my contact information, I couldn't help but feel a deep, swirling mix of emotions. Relief, anger, fear. They all melded into a cocktail that left me shaking even as I headed home on the bus, which had arrived unnoticed during the commotion. I couldn't have known then that this night would stick with me, a stark reminder of the darkness that often lurked just out of sight, and the unexpected moments when we're called to stand against it. As the bus rumbled away from the mall, the dim lights flickering overhead, I found my thoughts swirling with the night's events. The girl's frightened eyes haunted me, a stark image against the backdrop of an ordinary workday evening that had turned abruptly into something much more sinister. In the days that followed, the incident at the bus stop became a sort of shadow that trailed behind me, nudging at the edges of my daily routines. I'd walk through the same mall corridors, surrounded by the same bustling crowds. Yet there was a shift in perspective that I couldn't quite shake off. Every whispered conversation seemed more urgent. Every shadow at the bus stop more menacing. The police had been in touch a few times, asking for any further details I could remember about the man or his truck. They mentioned that they were reviewing security footage, trying to get a better image of the license plate. It was unsettling to think of him still out there, perhaps watching, perhaps planning another attempt. The police assured me they were doing everything they could, but it was little comfort against the nagging anxiety that had settled in my chest. I found solace in talking about the incident with my coworkers, who were equally shaken when they heard the story. We started coordinating our shifts so that no one would have to walk to the bus stop alone after dark. It was a small measure, but it brought a sense of solidarity that was comforting. We were looking out for each other, bound together by a shared determination to keep our small corner of the world safe. One late afternoon, about a week after the incident, I received a call from the girl's mother. Her voice was warm, yet I could hear the underlying tremble of fear that hadn't quite left her. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her words thick with emotion. "You stepped in when you didn't have to. You might have saved her life." We talked for a while, and she told me how her daughter was doing, back at school, but cautious, a little quieter than before. They were considering counseling, something to help her process what had happened. It struck me then how deeply our lives had intersected in that brief, terrifying moment, and how the ripples of that night reached far beyond what I had witnessed. Months passed, and the mall began to feel normal again. The police never did catch the man, though they called occasionally with updates, assuring me they hadn't given up. Life moved on, as it always does, but the experience remained with me, a reminder of the fragility of our everyday safety and the strength we sometimes have to summon from nowhere. It was during one of these reflective moments, sitting in the break room sipping coffee on a slow Tuesday, that I realized how profoundly that night had affected my view of the world. It wasn't just about being more cautious or aware, though I certainly was both. It was about understanding the power of intervention, the importance of being there for one another, even strangers. The ordeal taught me about the strength we hold collectively, the resilience of the human spirit, and the incredible impact of small acts of courage. It shaped my resolve to never stand by passively, to always be someone who acts, who cares, who protects. In many ways, it was the moment that defined not just the course of that night, but the direction of my life thereafter. As I looked around at the familiar faces of my coworkers, the chatter of customers blending with the music overhead, I felt a renewed sense of purpose and connection. We were all in this together, navigating the complexities of life with a bit more wisdom and a lot more courage. And somewhere in that realization, I found not just fear and anxiety, but an immense, profound gratitude for the life I had and the people I shared it with. It was late December in Minnesota, and the world seemed to be buried under a thick, heavy blanket of snow. My friend Alex and I had decided, against our better judgment, to drive up north to spend the weekend in a small cabin owned by his family near Lake Itasca. It was supposed to be a quiet retreat from the chaos of our city lives, a chance to unwind before the madness of the holidays fully took hold. We arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the freshly fallen snow. The temperature was plummeting as darkness crept in, and the wind howled like a chorus of wailing spirits, whipping the powdery snow into ghostly swirls around our car. The cabin was an old structure, charming in its rustic way, with peeling red paint and a crooked chimney that puffed out smoky breaths into the frigid air. As we unloaded our gear, the crunch of our boots on the snow was the only sound piercing the silence around us. We quickly made our way inside, eager to escape the biting cold. The interior of the cabin was dimly lit by the fading light filtering in through small, frost-covered windows. We fumbled around, finding candles and a couple of old lanterns to brighten the space as the darkness outside pressed against the glass like an unwelcome visitor. The main room was simple, a stone fireplace at one end, a couple of worn sofas draped with threadbare blankets, and a small kitchenette tucked away in the corner. As Alex started a fire, I decided to explore the rest of the cabin. The floorboards creaked underfoot, complaining about the cold as much as we were. I made my way to the back of the cabin, where two small bedrooms faced each other across a narrow hallway. Each room was sparsely furnished, containing only a bed and a dresser, their surfaces covered with a thin layer of dust, untouched in what looked like years. Returning to the living room, I noticed a peculiar thing. A set of muddy boot prints leading from the front door to the middle of the room, stopping abruptly. I called Alex over, my voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. "Did you come in here before you started the fire?" I asked, pointing at the tracks. He shook his head, a puzzled look crossing his face. "No, I've been with you since we got here. And look, the snow's piled up against the door. It hasn't been opened in a while." A chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside ran down my spine. We both stood there, staring at the mysterious prints, wondering if perhaps the previous visitors had left them. But the logical part of my mind whispered that the snow would have melted any trace from before. Trying to shake off the unease, we turned our attention to settling in for the night. We cooked a simple meal, talking and laughing, trying to ignore the increasingly fierce wind that rattled the windows. As the night deepened, the temperature inside the cabin barely kept the cold at bay, despite the fire roaring in the fireplace. We decided to turn in early, the day's travel having taken its toll. I chose the bedroom on the left, with a window that framed the now black night outside. The bed was cold and uninviting, but exhaustion soon pulled me under into a fitful sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke to the sound of something tapping against glass. Disoriented, I sat up, straining my ears against the howl of the wind. There it was again, a rhythmic tapping, like fingertips drumming on the window pane. Heart pounding, I mustered the courage to get up and pull back the curtain slightly. What greeted me was a wall of white, the snow falling so thickly it seemed as if the world outside had vanished. But then, as I watched, a shadow passed briefly through the swirls of snow, a darker patch against the white. It was gone before I could make sense of it, and I told myself it was just the snow playing tricks on my mind. Lying back down, I tried to calm my racing heart, telling myself it was nothing, just the storm and my imagination. But sleep eluded me, the image of that fleeting shadow etched behind my eyelids. Little did I know, the true horror of our snowy retreat was only beginning to unfold. As dawn approached, the storm outside gradually subsided, leaving the world in a hushed silence. I rose from my bed, feeling the lingering effects of a restless night. The cabin felt colder, as if the storm had seeped into the very bones of the building. I found Alex in the kitchen, staring out the frosted window with a mug of coffee in his hands. He seemed tense, his eyes shadowed and distant. "Morning," I greeted him, trying to inject some warmth into my voice. He merely nodded, his gaze still fixed on the scene outside. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "Yeah, something was off. I heard tapping, like on the window or the wall. And footsteps, maybe. Couldn't tell if I was dreaming or it was real," Alex replied, finally turning to look at me. The cabin felt different in the daylight, less welcoming than when we had arrived. As we ate a quiet breakfast, the weight of unease settled over us, thick as the snow outside. We decided to clear the snow from around the cabin and check for any damage from the storm. Donning our heavy coats and boots, we stepped outside into a world transformed. The snow lay heavy on every surface, creating a surreal landscape of soft edges and muffled sounds. As we shoveled a path from the front door, I noticed something odd about the distribution of the snow around the windows. In some areas, it appeared as if someone, or something, had wiped it away, perhaps to peer inside. "We should check the perimeter," Alex suggested, his voice low, as if afraid to be overheard, "just to make sure everything's secure." Agreeing, we split up, each taking a side of the cabin. The crunch of snow underfoot seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. As I rounded the corner, I paused. There, pressed into the snow, were fresh footprints. They led from the window of my bedroom, disappearing into the woods that surrounded the cabin. Heart racing, I called out to Alex, who came running. We followed the tracks as they meandered through the trees, the depth suggesting whoever made them hadn't been concerned with the stealth or hurry. The trail ended abruptly at a small clearing. In the middle, surrounded by disturbed snow, was an old, weathered book. It looked bizarrely out of place, the leather cover wet and swollen from the snow. Alex picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The pages were filled with what looked like journal entries, but the writing was erratic, almost frantic. "Listen to this," Alex said, his voice shaky as he read aloud. "They don't believe, but they will. They must. It's here, and it waits in the storm." What does that mean? We stared at each other, the implications of the words chilling us more deeply than the cold. Deciding that we needed to leave, we hurried back to the cabin to pack our things. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, grew with every passing minute. As we threw our belongings into the car, a sudden gust of wind brought a piercing wail through the trees, a sound neither human nor animal, a scream of rage or pain that froze us in our tracks. "We need to go. Now," Alex yelled, nearly dragging me to the car. We sped away from the cabin, the eerie scream echoing in our ears long after it had faded away. We didn't speak much on the drive back, each lost in our thoughts, trying to process what had happened. In the safety of my own home, the terror of that night still lingers. I find myself listening for the faint tapping on the window or the whisper of footsteps in the snow. Alex and I haven't discussed it since, but sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I wonder if what we heard was really just the storm, or something far more ancient and hungry, waiting in the silence of the snow.